thank you very much for coming out this evening. We're very happy to have you. Thank you also for your patience. We were testing out some new things, and we're happy to say that we have Gillian O'Brien here with us tonight. So I'll spare you the intro and go straight to the good stuff. Gillian O'Brien has a BA and an MA in history from University College Dublin and a PhD from the University of Liverpool. Her MA is a study of the newspaper The United Irishman, the Northern Star, and her PhD is an examination of Anglo-Irish relations from the time of the 1798 Rebellion and the Act of Union. More recently, she's been working on urban history and is particularly interested in the histories of Dublin, London, and Chicago. She has recently returned from a residency at the Newberry Library in Chicago, where she was a Fulbright scholar. When not teaching, researching, or writing, Gillian is likely to be found walking by the sea, taking photographs, building bookcases, making jam, and a number of other delightful activities. Please join me in welcoming Gillian O'Brien.
Thank you very much. I was going to refer to all of my lovely images that I was going to use, so you can imagine them as I describe them. What I was going to do this evening is talk a little bit about the book and why I wrote it and the trials and tribulations of both researching and writing it, and not tell you a huge amount about the story, so that I can make you buy the book. I came to this project without really knowing anything about Chicago at all. My background was in Irish history and largely Irish Republican history and Republican history of an earlier century, so largely Republican history of the late 18th century. I came to Chicago for a month to do a very small research project and loved Chicago so much that I thought I would need to find a larger research project. You can't really do 18th century Chicago history if you're interested in newspapers. It can be a very short project. So while I was doing some research on late 19th century Chicago, I came across an account of a funeral, and the funeral that was the account was the funeral of Dr. Cronin, and it went on for pages in the Chicago papers, and sort of repeatedly, every day after day, there was these accounts of this man that I'd never heard of, and this murder that seemed to have had repercussions both in Chicago and much further afield. So I left the Newberry Library that evening determined to read a book about the murder and discover that nobody had written a book about the murder. Which isn't actually true. 7 people had written books about the murder, but they'd written them all in the year or two after the murder had happened, and they were, to a large extent, transcripts of the trial. So they were journalists who'd covered the murder trial, who then had written up their newspaper accounts and then published them. There were a number of fictional accounts, there were a number of dime novels, but nobody had written to the story from a much greater distance. So I thought if anyone was fool enough to give me funding to do the book, I'd come back and do research for it. And so this is the book, the result of that. Oh, okay. I'll use it if you have. I'll change. I do. Okay. Yeah, brilliant. So I think one of the reasons that that caught my attention was this quote from the Chicago Weekly Journal of 29th of May 1889, where it says, "To the horrors of the French criminal history, in the exploits of Jack the Ripper in London, or to the darkest and bloodiest mysteries of secret crime in New York, resort must be had to find a parallel for this case." And I think because I knew about the Jack the Ripper story in London, and when comparisons were made to Jack the Ripper, that sort of intrigued me and what made me want to continue on. And so there are 2 main characters, I think, that sort of bring this story together. The first is this man here, and you'll be pleased to know that most, I think, of possibly all of the images I'm looking at using, not all of them, almost all of them are reproduced in the book. This is Alec Sullivan, And I was just going to introduce you to Alexander Sullivan with a very short piece from the book before moving on. So this is from chapter 1, which is called City of Big Shoulders. In the spring of 1873, a short, dapper man with piercing and magnetic eyes stepped off the train into the charred, scarred streets of Chicago. Dressed in his trademark black suit, complete with cowboy boots and pearl-handled pistol, Alexander Sullivan was trying to rebuild himself and his reputation, much like the city itself. Huge swathes of Chicago had been destroyed by the Great Fire of 1871 that began at the back of DeKalb Street on the west side, leapt the Chicago River, and travelled north as far as Fullerton Avenue and Lincoln Park. For a day and a half the fire had raged, and when it was over, little remained of the city centre, apart from the limestone water tower on Michigan Avenue and Malin D. Ogden's residence on West Walton Street, where the Newbury Library now is. An estimated 300 people had died, 18,000 buildings had been reduced to glowing embers, and almost a third of the city's population had lost their homes. Faced with disaster, the citizens of Chicago rallied, and as soon as land was cleared of the smoking debris, new, bigger, better, taller buildings rose to replace the old. Despite the depression that gripped much of the United States in the early 1870s, by June 1873, the city was sufficiently resurgent to host a Jubilee Week to celebrate the rebuilding. Chicago began to rival and then to overtake the expansion of New York, Boston and Philadelphia. Within 20 years of the Great Fire, the city boasted the first skyscrapers and the fastest growing population in the country. Shouldn't really be called second city at all. For Sullivan, as for others arriving in Chicago in the aftermath of the Great Fire, the city was a place of opportunity, of hope and of expectation. Every week, thousands of young men and women clambered out of trains to seek their fortune in the bustling metropolis. As his train slowed on the approach to the station, the iconic sights and sounds that would define the city for several generations became clear. Emerging from the bustle and smoke and clamour of engines and bells in Union Depot, new Chicagoans caught their first glimpse of the dingy houses, smoky mills and tall elevators that surrounded the station. Aside from Alexander Sullivan, 1873 also saw the arrival in Chicago of Albert Parsons and Louis Sullivan. Parsons' involvement with anarchists would culminate in a pivotal moment for the city and for labour history during the Haymarket Riot of 1886, while Louis Sullivan's buildings would come to define the Chicago of the late 19th century. Alexander Sullivan was determined to make his mark too, and his appearance frequently attracted attention. Always clean-shaven and impeccably dressed in a black suit, he was a slim man with grey eyes and arresting facial features. One admiring contemporary observed that his features had the delicacy of sculpture, an indicator of refined, proud and sensitive nature, while in the frank and penetrating glance of his eyes is easily discerned a character of extraordinary mental capacity, which is combined with courage, tact and persistence. Not everyone was so impressed. William O'Brien, a member of the Irish Parliamentary Party, thought him a liverish man, strong-browed and strong-jawed, about whose bloodless lips and sharp white teeth there played a certain pitilessness, which all his softness of voice and studious airs of deference could not change to anything better than cold self-control. Wherever Sullivan went, opinion tended to be sharply divided. He had become of necessity something of a master of reinvention. Between 1865 and 1895, he was variously a respectable businessman, the owner of a shoe store, a tax collector, a newspaper owner, a journalist, a city official, a postmaster, the leader of a secret revolutionary society, a lawyer, an abolitionist, a Republican, a Democrat, the president of the Irish National League of America, a gambler and a murderer. America was the land of opportunity, and Alexander Sullivan was a great opportunist. And that's very much what Alexander Sullivan was. But the other main character in this story is Dr. Patrick Henry Cronin, who was alive for the first half of the book and sadly dead for the second half of the book. And the man most closely associated with Cronin's murder was Alexander Sullivan, despite the fact that he was never actually charged in connection with the case, though he was arrested. These men both knew each other. They knew each other from the early 1880s. Sullivan was in Chicago from the 1870s, and Patrick Cronin came to Chicago in the early 1880s. He was a medical doctor, and he got his first job in Chicago as a result of Alexander Sullivan. His first job was as a doctor in Cook County Hospital. Both men were also members of Fine Gael secret Irish Revolutionary Society, which was dedicated to freeing Ireland from Britain by use of force. In theory, they ought to have been allies. In practice, they were anything but. Both were very ambitious. Cronin saw Alexander Sullivan as a great rival. Sullivan controlled Fine Gael. Sullivan had all the power, and Cronin believed that he could do a better job. He also suspected that Alexander Sullivan was what he called a professional patriot. And there was nothing worse for an Irish Republican than to be called a professional patriot. And by that, it really meant that it was somebody who was in it for their own good. So they would claim to be interested in Irish freedom, but really what they were interested in was furthering their own sort of business within wherever the country or the city that they lived in. And Cronin was convinced that that's what Sullivan was up to. And he had some evidence to prove this. He was able to prove that $100,000, which in today's terms is about $2.5 million, had been taken by Alexander Sullivan. Whether it was to invest it for Fine Gael, which was his argument, is one thing. Others thought he was investing it entirely for himself. He invested it in the Chicago Board of Trade and lost every penny of that $100,000. Cronin was determined to make this well known publicly, and so he went around within Fine Gael announcing that this money had been stolen. It didn't go down very well. In a secret society, these things ought to remain secret. And that's one of the problems, or one of the difficulties I had with researching the book. It's never a good idea to research a secret society, because by their very nature they tend either not to have records or to have destroyed their records. Wow. So the research for the book took me to New York, to Chicago, to London, to Dublin, to Belfast to try and find and retrace the steps of this secret society. And not all of their papers disappear. This is a series of instructions for members of Fine Gael, which isn't in the book. But you have all sorts of things, makes it slightly Masonic, so you can see it's out of focus, which is the photograph, not the picture. The hailing sign of recognition. So how would you know somebody was a member of Fine Gael? Well, you would insert the first finger of your left hand inside your shirt collar, and you would move it slowly towards the front button. So you would meet someone and do something like this to indicate that you were both members. And the answering sign was that you would draw your middle finger of your right hand and your right eye, across your right eye, towards your cheekbone twice. So you'd have people in Chicago doing all sorts of weird hand signals. There were test words. There were all of these were designed so that you would know you were a member of the secret society. Within Fine Gael too, they had their own codes. There was a cipher, a special way that you would write certain words. So if you were writing a secret code letter about Fine Gael business, whether this was in Chicago or New York, because Fine Gael was spread right across the United States. So instead of writing any of these words, instead, for war, you would have this. That's war in Fine Gael code. This is Ireland. This is England. And my favourite one, which I'm not going to attempt to say, is revolutionary. And what you do, some of you will have already worked out this very simple cipher, is you simply replace one letter with the next letter in the alphabet. So instead of I, you have J, instead of R, you've got S. It didn't take the British very long to decipher this code. Yeah. So they also wrote in invisible ink, and they sent letters telling you how you would read what they'd written in invisible ink, but they didn't do that in invisible ink. So there are all sorts of problems with the secrecy of Fine Gael. But you were not supposed to bring any issues from within the society out more broadly. And when Cronin announced quite publicly that he felt that Alexander Sullivan had stolen $100,000, that created huge tensions within the clan. For his trouble, Cronin was expelled. He didn't go quietly, and he continued to talk about this $100,000 to anybody who cared to listen. The clan split. Sullivan was convinced that he was going to be killed. And there was some evidence to suggest that there was a conspiracy afoot. A number of times he was called out on missions of mercy where people had allegedly been injured. When he turned up, they were to vacant lots. There were all sorts of sort of things happened to make him suspect that his life was in danger. And on the 4th of May 1889, he was seen alive for the last time. He was called out to go to help an injured man in Lakeview. So he travelled north in a buggy to Lakeview and was never seen again. The police were called. They were asked to investigate this case of a missing man, but the police were not interested. He was a single man. He was entitled to not return home on a Saturday evening. They maintained that he may have left the country or left the city. All sorts of rumours abounded as to why he may have left the city. One was that he had an affair with the wife of a patient. Another was that he had botched an operation, was forced to flee. And another was that he was a spy. 2 weeks after he disappeared, his body was found in a sewer in Lakeview. These are two different representations of the finding of his body. The top one is from a print published in New York. Lakeview at the time was a very isolated area, but people reading in New York had no idea where Lakeview was, had no idea what it looked like, so you get a very suburban image. This is from a Chicago newspaper, which is a much more realistic image of where the body was found in a sewer. His body was found naked in a sewer. There was a huge amount of speculation as to why his body was found naked. And that speculation rested on the fact that it was believed by many that they took his clothes and all of his identifying papers because they wanted to send those to London, where they would find a dead body that closely resembled the dead man. They would drop that body into the River Thames, pull him out, say, this is Dr. Cronin, he'd gone to London, clearly he was a spy. But things didn't quite work out the way they intended. This is a map of where all of the activity took place. And the reason I just wanted to show it there is that most of the places, in fact all of the places, are really north of the river. In the late 1880s, and particularly associated with the Irish, if you're talking about murders, if you're talking about violence, people associated all of that with the south side. But in fact this murder was of a middle-class man, which took place north of Chicago, because Lakeview at the time wasn't actually part of Chicago. All of the activity took place north of the river. He was killed north of the river, and a number of people associated with it would have been very well regarded sort of middle-class individuals. This is in fact where he was killed. So this is Lakeview. It doesn't resemble Lakeview at all as it is today. So you see there are four. What I like most about this picture is that the first building there is actually a real estate agency. So they set up in order to sell off the plots on this site. The building that's directly behind there is the cottage that Cronin was killed in, and the building the far right is the house that he had been called to on this errand of mercy, where allegedly a man had been injured. So as you can see, it's a very isolated area. All around this area at the time in Lakeview, you had celery farms and a lot of other kind of agricultural businesses at the time. So very few people were passing. There were very few witnesses who saw Cronin on the night that he was murdered. When his body was found naked in a sewer, it won't come as any surprise to learn that the newspapers were fascinated. And the newspapers were fascinated because it wasn't a murder as a result of a barroom brawl, which is most murders, or a domestic dispute. So between the two, barroom brawls and domestic disputes were the two main causes of murder, not only in Chicago, but right across the United States. This was something else. This was a murder where a man had been very brutally murdered. The newspaper said he was killed by blows of an ice pick. It's not actually true. It was blows of a chisel. It doesn't make it much better. And his body was found naked in a sewer 2 weeks later. And it was a time when sensational papers sold stories. This is a contemporary image of sensation, with his hand on the shoulder of an editor, putting pressure on the editor to make the story more and more sensational. The more sensational, the better. And you didn't get much more sensational than the Cronin murder. This is a dime museum, it's a dime novel from the summer of 1889, during the time of the investigation. Several dime novels, and these sold, they were cheap, they sold in huge quantities. It's very hard to find them today because they were disposable. People read them and threw them out. There are two of them, two different dime novels in the Chicago History Museum about the Cronin murder. You could also go to dime museums. There were several dime museums in Chicago at the time. And you could go and see waxwork reproductions of the dead man. You could see waxwork reproductions of the men who'd been accused of his murder. You could see the horse that had drawn the buggy that had taken him north to Lakeview. So it generated a huge amount of sensation, and people were hugely interested in the murder. This is, I think, my favourite image of the murder, which was published in New York during the summer of 1889. So you see the dead man, Cronin, and you see a very Simeonized version of an Irishman standing over him, with Freedom to Ireland in the flag behind. And it was a story that caught the attention of the anti-immigrant groups. And anti-immigrant groups felt that this murder showed that you couldn't trust the Irish, because you'd let the Irish in, and yes, they might take an American passport, but they were always going to have a loyalty first to Ireland, and they would be involved in these secret societies, and that it was okay if that violence overspilled in Ireland or Britain, but it certainly wasn't okay when blood was spilt on the streets of Chicago. And so anti-immigrant groups used the Cronin murder as a way of saying, don't let the Irish in, they can't be trusted. And so you get quite a lot of images similar to this at the time. Other ones are like this, where you've got 3 sticks of dynamite. One is anarchy, the other is Clan Gael, and the third one is vendetta. So it's all of those groups who were creating mayhem, or potentially creating mayhem. And in the aftermath of Haymarket and the Haymarket riots of 1886 and the Haymarket bombing, there was great fear in Chicago about sort of immigrant groups. And you get this issue of dynamite and these sort of images being reproduced through the year. When it came to the murder trial, it was the longest running trial in American history at the time. It took weeks and weeks to get 12 men who did not already have an opinion. They interviewed 1,115 men to try and get 12 men to sit on the jury. Almost all of those men came and said, we know they're guilty. I've read the Daily News, the Herald, the Tribune, I take all of these papers, I read the Inter-Ocean, I know they're guilty. None of those were allowed on the jury. But there were issues with the jury that was even chosen. There were allegations that the jurors had been bribed to find the men not guilty, so the jury had to be re-chosen. And the trial eventually started 2 months after they began to just choose a jury.
Excuse me, who was on trial?
The trial, I wouldn't like to tell you that. That would ruin the story. Well, 5 men. 5 men were on trial.
Okay.
Well, I'll give you away one of the men. One of the men, and this is why the newspapers really grasped this as a story. One of the men who was on trial was a man called Daniel Coughlin. And Daniel Coughlin was a detective in the police force. Not only was he an Irish detective in the police force, so there was some suspicion kind of thrown upon him, but he had been the man tasked with finding Cronin when he disappeared. So the chief detective on the case looking for the missing man turns out to be one of the men on trial. They brought 5 men to trial. They named 9 men that they felt were guilty, but they didn't find them. They disappeared, they left Chicago, and in some cases had actually left America. So the trial lasts through November, December of 1889, and ends at the very end, just before Christmas. Won't tell you quite what happened. Some people are found guilty. This is one of the most famous, I think, images that's reproduced. It's in all sorts of high school textbooks about sort of this big mortar, where the big melting pot where you bring in all the immigrants and they all transform into Americans. And you see one immigrant who does not transform or doesn't want to transform into an immigrant, and he's an Irishman. And I had been familiar, before I started on this project, I was familiar with this particular image. And it wasn't until someone said, have you looked at the original? And I said, no. He said, I think it might have something to do with the Cronin murder. And when you look at it closely, you can see that he's carrying a flag that says Clan Gael. And it's very clearly connected to the Cronin murder, or certainly inspired by the Cronin murder. Now, Cronin, when he was murdered, a fund was established because he wasn't that well known when in Chicago. He was well known. He sang in Holy Name Cathedral, so he was well known there. He was well known within secret societies, but that's a quite small group. And he was well known to his patients. But he wasn't sort of a famous figure in Chicago society. But 40,000 people lined Michigan Avenue to see his funeral. So by then, he was extremely well known. And a fund began to build a monument. He was buried in Calvary Cemetery in Evanston. And a fund, $5,000 was raised to build a 50-foot tall memorial with a bronze bust of Cronin to be placed in Calvary Cemetery on his grave. 3 times I went to Calvary Cemetery to look for his grave. Twice I failed to find it, despite having the coordinates, as I wandered around all the various mausoleums looking for this enormous statue, knowing what he looked like, couldn't find anything to do with it. That's his grave. It's a tiny 1 foot by 2 foot, very small granite plaque that just says DrPH Cronin, 1846 to 1889, rest in peace. So it was interesting that a man who had campaigned so much against corruption, suddenly that 5,000 that had been raised for his memorial was spent on something else. So it's a very small plot there. And so that really is sort of all I wanted to say. If anybody has any questions, I'm obviously very happy to answer questions. I won't tell you exactly what happened. Well, I might if you've already got a copy of the book. But if anyone has any questions about researching or writing or the story, I'm very happy to take any questions you might have. Yep.
What happened with Alec Sullivan?
He was arrested because everybody said it was Alexander Sullivan. He was arrested. He was arrested late one night in his house. He lived up on Oak Street, so he was very nice house, very well to do. And he was taken in but never charged because they couldn't prove that he had anything to do with the murder. $20,000 was posted as bail, which was a not inconsiderable amount. What I do know is whether or not he was actively involved, I'm almost entirely certain that he funded the defence, because all of the men who were charged, with the exception of the detective, were not wealthy men, and they had a very well-to-do and very expensive legal team defending them.
Did he continue as head of the Klan?
No. He continued in the Klan, and he did try to wield a considerable amount of power afterwards, but he really disappears. You don't hear of him again until 1895. And then he reappears, very timely, he reappears on the St. Patrick's Day Parade. And that's his first public outing, sort of 6 years later.
When we read this, will we find some insights on your part as to what really happened?
I think so. I had an interesting dinner some years ago with a woman called Mary Marr, and Mary Marr had written a sort of a fictionalised account of this. And during the dinner, I said to her, would you mind if I said that I think that your great-grandfather was a murderer? And she said, no, I'm fine, that's fine. In fact, she'd written an account. I think a number of the people who were involved in the murder were never actually tried. And Mary Marr, her great-grandfather, was one of those men. And she believes that he was one of the murderers. So I think you'll find there's a sort of story about a more minor character who was charged because he looked like somebody else. It was very much a case of mistaken identity. So I think in the last chapter, I think I outlined what I think happened. Though obviously I could possibly be wrong, but I'm fairly confident. I'm fairly confident at this stage.
Did Dr. Oh,
Sorry, no, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Did he do anything other than just being Irish to even warrant being murdered by people?
Well, no. In terms of his the motive for it, yes, there wasn't any other motive to do with his medical practice or to do with anything other involvement. So the only reason or the only sort of motive for murdering him was because he had said that Sullivan had stolen his money. And it wasn't even so much the stealing of the money, it was because he'd made it public. It was because Clonagale had thrived really on being secret. And once he had made this public and started having people talk about it and casting suspicion over the society, that was really the motive for wanting him silenced. Sorry.
Because he's betraying the organization, not just that he's a threat to the individual Sullivan, right?
Yeah, I think that's the real thing, is that it wasn't just because he said money had been stolen, because he could have dealt with that, but it was because firstly some people thought he betrayed the organisation, but the other thing that had happened was as soon as he'd accused Sullivan of stealing the money, rumours were spread, probably by Sullivan and his supporters, that Cronin was a spy and that Cronin was working on behalf of the British. And once a spy in Irish Republican circles tend not to thrive, they tend not to survive. Now, I don't think he was a spy, because I think if you were a spy, rather than pushing yourself away from the centre of power, you would ingratiate yourself with the centre of power, in this case Alexander Sullivan, so you would know what was going on if you were a spy reporting to the British. So I think that was entirely a false accusation. I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that he was a spy.
Can I ask you to talk a little bit about, I mean, just where and how you started to get out there and pull together some threads about Clonagale and what their history in Chicago was, and you know.
Well, when I started, I didn't really know very much about Clonagale in Chicago. I knew about sort of their sister organisation, the Irish Republican Brotherhood in Ireland and Britain, and I knew about what they'd done, and I knew about the bombing campaigns that had taken place in the mid-1880s in Britain. What I didn't know was the sort of the money trail, and all of that, all of the bombings that took place in Britain in the 1880s had been funded by money raised over here. And not specifically Chicago, but in
it was
the United
national.
States. Yes, yeah, oh, it was national. Clonagale began in 1867. Don't talk. The date will be in the book. But it was just begun by a guy called Jerome Collins, and it came out of a split with the Fenian organisation. And very often Clonagale is called the Fenians, but that's kind of a blanket term used for all Irish organisations.
Did Clonagale link back to any certain area or city in Ireland?
No,
Okay.
they were really, they began New York and then spread across the states, and then by the 1880s it became centralised in Chicago with Alexander Sullivan. So it's very much the American wing, and then the IRB, or the Irish Republican Brotherhood, are the Irish wing of that. But as everyone always says about an Irish, if you set up an Irish secret society, the first thing on the agenda is the split. So you've got splits always, you know, with all of these different groups running under different names at different points.
Now that we've opened this up to the Clonagale in Chicago, what did you find about the indication that one of the suspects was a Chicago police officer? What did you find about the infiltration of the Chicago Police Department during this time and around the time of the Haymarket?
There were certainly members of Clonagale within the police force. The police force was disproportionately Irish. The population of Chicago was about 17% Irish or Irish American, and the police force was about 50% Irish or Irish American. So you've got a very heavily Irish police force. To be honest, I didn't find an enormous amount of evidence of Clonagale deliberately targeting the police force or infiltrating. Yes, there were members who were also policemen, but I didn't find anything to suggest that there was a plan And certainly clan members got jobs for clan members, whether that was the police force or the Board of Public Works or in the stockyards. They certainly did that, but I don't think there was a real sort of plan to do that. I think they ran side by side, but not necessarily one because of the other. Have I answered every question? Excellent. We should all go now and buy the book, I think. Well, thank you all very much for coming out on a Wednesday evening.